Hello everybody and welcome to today's ISQua webinar, Physician Heal Thyself, with Peter Carter, CEO of ISQua. My name is Jane and I'm the Education Resource Manager, and I just wanted to run through administrative points with you before the webinar begins. For our fellowship participants, just to remind you that in order to gain points towards your fellowship for viewing the webinar, you have to answer a series of questions in our education forum. These will be available on the ISQua website after the webinar has finished. Peter will be taking a number of questions after the webinar, so if you have any questions, please type them into the GoToWebinar screen on the site. Just to say a few words about Peter before we begin. Peter previously held positions of Chief Executive Officer in the Specialist Medical Colleges of Psychiatrists and Surgeons in Australia and New Zealand over a period of 16 years before his current position of CEO of ISQua. Peter has taught in tertiary colleges and universities, including the Master of Business and Technology programme of the University of New South Wales, Australia, specialising in organisation for quality improvement, and he has held senior management positions in university. Concurrent with the above posts, Peter has also undertaken consultancy work, predominantly in the healthcare sector. So again, thank everybody for coming, and I'm going to hand you over to Peter in a few moments to begin the webinar. Now, okay. Peter, are you there?
Yes, Jane, I am.
Super. Well, I will hand over to you now to start your webinar.
Thank you, Jane, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, or wherever you happen to be around the world. You're very welcome, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to you about self-regulation in the healthcare sector. I've chosen the title Physician Heal Thyself. You will recognize this title of one that usually refers to a suggestion to people who are critical of others that they might look to their own faults first. I've taken the title literally here to refer to particularly self-regulation, where the profession itself is responsible for quality control within the profession and for regulating that profession. So what I plan for the webinar today is to provide you with some definitions so we know the terminology that we're using during the webinar, an introduction to the webinar. I'll be looking at the reasons for regulation. Why is regulation important? Why do we need it? I'll be relying on two slides that I'm using from Mike Durkin, who's Head of Patient Safety at the NHS, to just present to you the scale of the challenges that face us in healthcare when it comes to trying to ensure safety and quality. I guess the focal point of the webinar, in order to illustrate the advantages and disadvantages of both self-regulation and imposed regulation, will be the two case studies that I'm using. And so I'll go into those in a little detail because they raise a number of critical questions for us when we're looking at the best way to ensure quality through regulation of one sort or another. The beauty and the beast of self-regulation, the good and the bad, and then imposed regulation, Big Brother. Do we want regulation imposed upon the professions, particularly in healthcare? And then I'll be asking a few questions of you for you to consider. The definitions that I'm using today are definitions around professional self-regulation, and the arrangement whereby practitioners exercise authority and maintain control over their own profession. And it also talks about working conditions and self-discipline and looking at the individual behavior and also collective behavior. One of the interesting parts of this definition I found when I chose to use it was reference to working conditions, because very often the professional bodies that self-regulate in healthcare prefer not to consider working conditions as part of their remit. But realistically, working conditions often impact on quality, so I think they do bear consideration. The definition for imposed regulation I'm using is regulation that is controlled by government, is controlled and governed by law and oversighted by a public official. Now typically, I mean, this can be through case law or parliamentary law, but typically the imposition of regulation of this sort is through the bureaucratic process. I'm going to refer to a third form of regulation, which I'm not going to be dealing with in any detail today, but it is a powerful form of regulation, so I think I should mention it, and I'd invite you to consider it. This is regulation which is by private parties. It's not official, it's not formal, it's not legislative, it is, but nevertheless it is powerful. And if you imagine for a moment the impact that the insurance industry, for example, has on the way in which professionals practice, then you'll see that this can influence healthcare and change the way in which healthcare is conducted, and therefore it has an impact on quality. I would like to deal with that at some future stage in a webinar because I found that a very interesting part of the regulatory process and a very compelling part. So the choice that we're faced with then is the options we have are self-regulation, imposed regulation, or perhaps we can consider what might be a hybrid of the two. And the webinar, as it progresses, will start to move in that direction. I've taken something of an economic model in looking at why we should regulate. There are many reasons, and all go to the questions of either quality or equity. And while this approach that I'm taking might lean a little towards the economic or the marketplace, we'll pursue it anyway because I think it does shed light on the reasons for regulation. So the first that I'll be looking at is market failure, then the public interest, and then the private interest. The first then, market failure, refers to an asymmetry of information, that is an imbalance of information. It's essentially a term drawn from economics, and in short it means that there's an imbalance in information between the two parties in a transaction. So inevitably one party is at a disadvantage, which means their interests are not properly represented. And one way in which we can seek to represent the interests of the party that is the less informed in that transaction is through regulation. So that is one reason we might look at regulation. So in the healthcare context, the disadvantaged party clearly is the patient. The patient relies on the professional's the professional healthcare provider's expertise. They don't have the knowledge in what is a really complex area. So regulation is often used to help redress that imbalance. Now, the other concern in these circumstances is the question of supply-induced demand. The patient doesn't know what the patient doesn't know. So you or I, in the presence of a healthcare professional, don't know the absence of knowledge that we have. And this puts the person with whom we're dealing in a significant position. The other thing that it does is that it does lead to the potential for supply-induced demand. That is to say that rather than demand, in a normal context, demand will influence supply. In this case, the asymmetry of information leads to supply-induced demand. Now, this can be done knowingly or unknowingly by the professional. It's usually unknowingly, and there has in recent times been moves on the part of the professional associations and societies to try to ensure that the professionals that they are responsible for actively seek to redress that imbalance by providing more information to the patients. This is not unique to healthcare. You and I know very well that when we consult any professional, we are relying on their advice, and this is expertise and information that we don't have. So when my accountant tells me that perhaps it would be wise for me to purchase more of his services, or my plumber tells me that if I don't do a particular improvement in the plumbing in my house, something dire will happen, I'm more inclined to listen to them. But in healthcare, the stakes are much higher and the complexities are much greater. So the problem of asymmetry of information is more significant. So the consumer needs protection, and this can be done through regulation. The public interest is the second of the three areas I'm looking at, and the public interest is served by ensuring that monopolies do not develop, that cartels do not develop, that these professions that are the repositories of information and knowledge don't use that to influence the marketplace and to create demand or to manipulate prices. This is a serious matter, and it does have practical impact in that the control of supply can increase prices. And an example I can give you of this is when I was CEO of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. The college, which is the body that trains surgeons to practice, it controls entry to the profession, and it has the power to determine how many surgeons are in the marketplace. A government, you'll be aware that waiting lists throughout the world are a very topical issue, and they're a very sensitive issue to governments, and that they always arise around election time. And politicians are very sensitive to this, and they'll do anything that they can to ensure that they can keep a promise that waiting lists will be less if they are elected into office. And so the accusation was made against the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, which trains surgeons for Australia and New Zealand, that they were controlling entry to the profession. They were restricting the supply of surgeons in order that they could keep the salaries of surgeons high. So restricting supply with a high demand means that you can charge whatever you like for the services you're offering. The real motivation behind the government at that time was to try and reduce waiting lists, because that's long waiting lists, as I've mentioned, are very unpopular. The college responded to this by saying their job was to ensure quality, and that they weren't about to shortcut training programs at the expense of quality. The College of Surgeons said that it demanded a particular level of quality and quality control, and by flooding the market with surgeons, that was jeopardized. And the other reason they said they are not in position to rapidly increase the supply of surgeons was that surgeons are trained in predominantly in public hospital positions, and the public hospital positions are funded by the government. And unless the government was prepared to pay to fund additional training positions, there was nowhere for the surgeons to train. In the end, there was an accommodation between the two parties, and the matter was resolved. But the public interest is served by ensuring that supply is not controlled to keep prices high. Private interest is one that refers to market equilibrium, and you'll be aware that healthcare services are expensive, and those that are in a position to pay can generally afford to have healthcare services when they like them, and when they want them, and in the facilities they'd like to have them in. And so this leads to a market equilibrium, and efforts to address this have been made throughout the world, and these efforts have resulted in creation of bodies like the National Health Service in the UK and Medicare in Australia. So it's an effort to try and more evenly distribute healthcare services. Inevitably, however, market forces still manage to skew this, so the system ends up with a mix of public and private. Yet regulation does remain a means of more equal distribution of healthcare resources. Having talked about regulation and why we might need it, it would be well worth reminding ourselves of the scale of the challenges. And as mentioned, Mike Durkin has to be thanked for providing this slide and the next one. But it just puts in context what we're dealing with. And we're dealing with 140,000 different ways that the human body can go wrong. We're dealing with over 6,000 medicines for treating diseases. And we're dealing with something over 4,000 ways of treating the diseases. So it's not surprising, given that, complexity and given the figures that you now see before you, that things can go wrong. I'd like to turn now to the first of my case studies, which is a surgical case study. And this case study refers to the case of Dr. Jayant Patel. Now, Dr. Patel was an Indian-trained surgeon who was practicing in the United States and had been licensed in 2 states in the USA. Dr. Patel arrives in Australia to fill an area of need position. So he has Indian qualifications, he has been registered in the United States, and he's recruited to fill an area of need position in Australia. Now, an area of need position is a position which is located in a smaller city or a town where the government or the regulators have found it difficult to place surgeons because the quality of life in these towns is not as great as the big cities. So overseas surgeons are recruited to move into these area of need positions. And Dr. Patel is recruited to move into one of these positions. And this position has been empty for some time. The government in Queensland, where this city is located, was very keen to fill it. And because of that, the Queensland government fast-tracks Dr. Patel into this rural hospital and registers him to practice. And they do this with great expediency. Normally what occurs in the case of overseas trained doctors is that the professional body responsible for the doctor in the profession in question is consulted about the doctor's training, qualifications and experience. And so that's a self-regulatory process. The registering authority engages a self-regulator to check on the qualifications, training and experience of the doctor to ensure the doctor is capable of undertaking, of practicing in the profession at the level in which the self-regulator, the person that trains the surgeons, expects that practice should be done at. In its interest to fast-track into this position, the Government of Queensland decides to bypass the self-regulator, and so the College of Surgeons is not consulted in this case. So Dr. Patel is not put under the microscope by the self-regulating body and goes straight into this area of need position. And so he slips under the radar and doesn't undergo peer assessment. Problems begin to emerge. So in 2003, within months of his appointment, there is concern on the part of one of the nurses who's working with Dr. Patel, and this nurse, Tony Hoffman, raises these concerns informally, and these are to do with his complication rates, and at that stage 1 death. The hospital, the employer at this time, doesn't act on the concerns that have been raised. One of the reasons that it could be speculated the hospital isn't acting is because Dr. Patel is conducting operations, and many of them are quite successful and error-free, and the hospital is funded on the basis of the throughput surgically, and so the hospital is content that the funding is coming through on the basis of the operations that Dr. Patel is conducting, and so it doesn't concern itself too much with the complications that Tony Hoffman has pointed to. In 2000, and so between 2003 and 2005, there is no action on this. Then in 2005, having not had concerns heeded, and when a second complaint is raised, this time by a patient, the decision is made on the part of these people that are concerned about this to go public. And once the press is involved, this is a big story. There are now deaths, and there are now numerous complications. And so the press gets interested and remains interested, and that forces the hand of the Queensland government, who then reacts, and as the story unfolds, you might consider overreacts. But it's been pushed into a corner, and it's now under significant public pressure to act. So it lays criminal charges of manslaughter. Now, laying criminal charges of manslaughter is a serious matter because that means that the prosecutors believe that Dr. Patel's action in one case, for example, in removing a colon to stop rectal bleeding, went well beyond an honest and reasonable belief that this was safe and sensible practice, and moves from medical negligence to criminality. So in 2010, Dr. Patel is found guilty of 3 counts of manslaughter. In 2012, however, this ruling is overturned on appeal, and by this time Dr. Patel has served 2 years in jail for the guilty manslaughter charges. The government doesn't leave it there. The pressure is still on. The families of the patients that have been affected and other campaigners continue to be very vocal, and the government is still under pressure. So it appeals the decision to overturn the charges, and it lays fresh charges of manslaughter and grievous bodily harm against Dr. Patel. And so, in addition to continuing to pursue this matter in the courts, the Queensland Government launches not just 1 inquiry and not just 2, but in fact 3 inquiries. And the first of these is the Morris inquiry, which is related to medical registration and how it was that Dr. Patel became registered in the first place. And this highlights the inadequacy of that, in that a simple Google search would have revealed that he had been struck off the medical register in at least one of the 2 states in the USA in which he had practiced, and this was not revealed by him, and it was not known to the authorities when they registered him. Had the matter been channeled through the self-regulating body, the College of Surgeons, then that is a check that would have been done, and so it would have been picked up early, but the government, as mentioned earlier, chose to bypass that. The second of the inquiries is the Davis inquiry, and it looks at a complete restructure of Queensland Health. It blames the bureaucracy for not picking up on these issues. And the third inquiry is the Foster inquiry, where further administrative changes are made to try and streamline the process. Now, the question that one must ask oneself is, would any of this have happened if the self-regulatory process had not been bypassed? Would lives have been saved and pain and suffering averted? And the answer to that question is almost certainly yes. So this doesn't mean that self-regulation is the entire answer to avoiding problems that arise in healthcare, but it certainly demonstrates the fact that it is certainly a useful way of monitoring quality. The criminal charges I've mentioned were laid, and ultimately Dr. Patel is charged with fraud. The government drops the charges of manslaughter, the new charges of manslaughter and grievous bodily harm, settles for 4 charges of fraud to which Dr. Patel pleads guilty, and just in the last few days, the decision has been made that 3 charges, he's pleaded guilty to 3 charges of fraud and 1 of attempted fraud and 1 of medical negligence, and he's been released from jail, time served sufficient, and I understand has left Australia. So, is there a bright side to this? Has any good come from this, despite the tragedy for the people who were damaged in the process? And the answer is yes. It has made. It's been a catalyst for significant changes. The first change is that there are now new national regulations on and accreditation systems for all healthcare professionals. So there is no longer a state-based system where you might have 6 different or 7 different jurisdictions that are ruling on different aspects of professional competence and registration. There is now a new national law of mandatory reporting. That is to say that it is now required under law that should someone consider that something is going wrong in a clinical setting, that they are required under law to report it. It's illegal not to report it, and charges can be laid if a person knowingly does not report incidents and episodes that are causing issues clinically. And there are better monitoring systems in place to pick up on problems with complications. And the most interesting thing perhaps, and for me, is that this has led to an entire cultural shift. Whereas there was a reticence in the past, a reluctance on the part of people to speak up when they noticed things were going wrong, particularly in the case of the specialized professions, where a professional is working and perhaps not working at the level that is required, there was a reluctance for other people to intervene. Now mandatory reporting has been introduced, but also this entire cultural shift. So the attitude has moved from one of reluctance to reporting to one where it's the norm to do so, and people are commended for doing so rather than sometimes sent to Coventry for doing so. Naturally, there's been a big increase in complaints, and naturally some of these can be malicious or vexatious, but it seems that the price to pay for an improved system is worth it. And in addition, there's much better pre and post treatment options and regimes available because people want to avoid the complications in the first place. The questions that arise in this case, and we'll return to these later, would self-regulation have prevented this and similar episodes from happening? Would self-regulation alone have done that? The converse question to that is, did the existence of self-regulation, the fact that self-regulation was available as an option, did that in fact lead to a less responsive and a less responsible system of imposed regulation? One must also ask, would imposed regulation itself be sufficient? Consideration in this, of course, is that if the only regulation available is that which is imposed by law and enacted by the bureaucracy, it's very likely the profession will be marginalized. And in healthcare, it's very complex. It changes rapidly. Those that know best practice are those that are practicing and keeping up to date with their practice. And to have an imposed regulatory system that relies on people without those skills would be ultimately problematic, in my view. My second case study is the case study which became known in Australia as the Beautiful Hospital. This is a private psychiatric hospital in the leafy suburbs of North Sydney, run by Dr. Harry Bailey, known as Chelmsford Hospital. And Dr. Bailey had decided that a way of treating depressive illness was through deep sleep therapy, and this ran through the 60s and 70s, and it had no scientific basis. He claimed to be basing it on some work that had been done elsewhere, usually with post-traumatic stressed soldiers in the UK, but it was entirely different and taken to great extremes. In the case of this therapy, patients were very heavily sedated with barbiturates to a comatose state and kept in that state for an average of 14 days and for as long as 40 days. Dr. Bailey likened this practice to the turning off of a television set, so that this turned off the brain, and while the brain was turned off, everything reassembled itself, and when the brain was turned on again, it was reconstructed in a better state, better than the depressed state in which the person went into the coma. As I say, it had no scientific basis. During the deep sleep phase of the therapy, patients were administered with ECT, and ECT, if it is effective, to be effective, the patient must fit, and patients, of course, in a deep coma cannot fit. So the whole regime was flawed from the start. But many patients died. 25 patients died directly as a result of this treatment, and another 24 patients committed suicide subsequently. And one can reasonably speculate that while the underlying illness may have had some cause in this, certainly the treatment would have had some cause as well. There was a complete breakdown of both the self-regulatory systems and the imposed regulatory systems in this case. And if it was not for the man on your screen, Barry Hart, this matter would not have come to light as early as it did. Barry Hart was ran a fitness centre, and he was a male model and television actor. And Barry Hart, in order to continue his career, had some plastic surgery done, which did not go well, and he fell into a depressed state and was referred to Chelmsford Private Hospital, the beautiful hospital. Sitting in the waiting area, the admitting area, waiting to be admitted, and agitated, concerned that perhaps he'd made the wrong choice in coming to this hospital, and he was approached by a nurse who suggested she could ease his anxiety and administered some drugs. And Barry Hart woke up 2 weeks later, never having given informed consent, never having been told about the nature of the treatment he was to experience, and had suffered as a result his claim brain damage and other illnesses. I would like to just quote from a newspaper report at the time to illustrate further the problems that the lack of self-regulation and imposed regulation caused in this case. And I'm reading from the Sydney Morning Herald of Tuesday the 2nd of August 1988, and I quote, "The last victim of Chelmsford did not die, although a doctor who saw her after her deep sleep treatment told her father it might be better if she had done. She is Miss Coralie Walker, and on February the 10th, 1979, aged 30, she became one of the last to enter the deep sedation ward at Chelmsford before it was closed forever. As with Miss Julie Myers, the first victim back in 1962, Miss Walker's case makes distressing reading. She was a happy, intelligent woman, a practicing physiotherapist who suffered bouts of depressive illness. While the cumbersome machinery of official investigation was at last being assembled 17 years after Miss Myers' death, Ms. Walker was being given her dose of barbiturates. At 11 a.m. on February the 13th, while in a coma, she stopped breathing. Although charges and deregistration action were eventually brought against the deep sleep doctors, the impetus behind them had no official source." And I end the quote there, and I'll pick it up again as a psychiatrist and a lawyer. Dr. Sidney Smith's a psychiatrist, and a lawyer acting for one of the victims are now reported in the paper, and I quote again, "Their first approach on October the 10th, 1980 was to the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists." Now I interpolate here, this is the self-regulating body, this is the professional body for psychiatrists. And I quote again, "In a 6-page letter they outlined the finding in the Hart versus Heron case," Heron being one of the doctors, "and said that they believed Dr. Heron and Dr. Bailey had given deep sleep treatment and electroshock therapy without patients' consent and had caused deaths through negligence." And the report goes on. "But the response of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists was the most striking of all. Dr. Smith," that is the doctor acting for the patients, "Dr. Smith had first written to this, the body in charge of professional standards, on October the 10th, 1980, and he renewed the correspondence 10 days later and followed it up again in November. It was not until July 16th, 1981, 9 months after the original letter, that the president of the College of Psychiatrists finally responded. He had," he said, "sent Dr. Smith's complaints on to the investigating committee of the New South Wales Medical Registration Board." Now, this is the imposed regulator. This is the government regulator. He went on, quote, "I have received a letter," this is Professor Ball speaking from the College of Psychiatrists, "I have received a letter from the investigating committee reference these matters, and their final paragraph says, and I quote, 'I am unable to refer to the committee the complaint from Dr. Smith, as it has been lodged in a manner as it has not been lodged in the manner prescribed by the Act. That is, it wasn't accompanied by a $10 deposit.' Professor Ball's letter concludes laconically, 'If you would like the complaint to go to the investigating committee, perhaps you would like to contact them and forward the relevant check for $10. Other matters are proceeding.'" So what went wrong? Well, first of all, in the self-regulatory regime, it was unresponsive. You can see the delay in the example that I've just given you in the quote from the newspaper. It was unresponsive. It lacks sanctions. That is to say, it's the professional regulator, but it has no power. to invoke any sanctions against its members. It is also influenced, and in this case in particular, and in many cases I believe, intimidated by colleagues. So the members of the organisation, in those days at least, were in a position to intimidate the organisation. And of course there was fear of litigation. They feared that if they acted against a powerful and influential professional, that they, the college themselves, might be sued, particularly if that action deprived the person of the right to make a living, as it may well have done if the self-regulating body's action had resulted ultimately in the imposed regulator removing the license to practice. So what went wrong with the imposed regulation? It too was unresponsive. Its mechanisms were poor. The processes that it used to investigate and to respond to complaints were very poor, and it too felt intimidated. And in addition to that, there was confusion between the two bodies. So confusion between the professional body, confusion between the government body, and in relation to their responsibilities, who was responsible for what and who had the power to act. Before looking at those case studies a little further, just let me say a word about statutory protection. I think this has been a major breakthrough in moves to enhance quality through correcting mistakes and errors. And this is very active and very effective in Australia, and I know it is practiced in other regimes as well, and it's becoming increasingly popular. And I know a colleague of mine who's an expert in this has been in the Middle East recently, talking to governments in the Middle East about introducing statutory protection, and I know that it's a growing trend. This enables people to talk about errors of judgment, errors of practice, errors in skill and knowledge, and deficiencies in knowledge, and to do something about correcting them, thus improving quality, without fear of repercussions and litigation. This doesn't protect people who are acting illegally or are responsible of gross negligence, but it does enable people who have in their professional practice made errors or mistakes to take steps to correct them. So they are able to talk about the errors, and they're able to retrain, they're able to take advice, they're able to discontinue, if necessary, particular practices. It also enables mortality and morbidity rates to be disclosed publicly without fear of those then being used against individuals or groups of individuals. It enhances and lifts to a new level the importance of information and disclosure of information. If you don't know about it, you can't do anything about it. It protects disclosure in peer review meetings. So the peer typically, say, for example, in surgery, the peer review meeting that will take place amongst clinicians after surgical rounds is a venue now, unlike in the past, where people can honestly and openly talk to their peers about their experiences, good and bad, in the operating room during the morning, for example, and their peers can, and this can be discussed amongst the peers. And if a problem is picked up with a particular person or a group of people, then they can be referred for corrective work, and lessons can be learnt, and mistakes in those circumstances are then not routinely repeated. So ultimately, the introduction of statutory protection, in my view, has made a big difference to making self-regulation more effective and responsive. And red tape is suggested, but in fact this is releasing the red tape in this case and making it less binding on the freedom of people to practice and to learn. We've spoken already about information asymmetry as one of the arguments for regulation, professional services and filling consumer gaps in knowledge, and the obligation now to do that, and the way in which regulation can help with that. Ultimately, I think the taking into account moves like self-regulation, which are very important, and there will be others of that ilk that will come through from time to time and become part of the process. But I think ultimately self-regulation and imposed regulation will work side by side, and there will be a balance between the two that will lead to a hybrid system that is in fact a much more effective system if you're awake to use it. I'll give Don Abadian the last word before I turn to a few questions. Systems awareness and systems design are clearly important for healthcare professionals, but they're not enough. They're enabling mechanisms only. It is the ethical dimensions of individuals that are essential to a system's success. And Don Abadian reminds us that ultimately the secret of quality is love. My questions then for you to consider are, would self-regulation alone have presented the deaths and injuries in the two case studies that I cited? Would imposed regulation alone have done so? Both of these were present in both case studies, but things still went wrong. Is there a system or a process that can ensure the public that they'll not be injured or killed by those in whom they put their trust? And finally, is Don Abadian right? Is it true, ultimately, that all you need is love? Jane, thank you. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was really, really interesting, and I hope that was of benefit. In fact, I'm sure it was of benefit for all of our participants. There's a huge amount of content there, and a huge amount also to inspire reflection on people's own practice. We have a few questions in, Peter, if you're there.
Yes.
Yep. The first question is, how are you able to address the issue of cartel behaviours, which seems inevitable, especially in the supplies of medicine?
Well, I think cartel behaviour is illegal in most jurisdictions. So legally, I mean, it's illegally to try and fix the market. Mm-hmm. It's illegally for monopolies to be created. And if there is any evidence that this is happening, it's really a real disincentive to doing this is the legal sanctions and in fact imprisonment that result. Cartel behaviour, and there have been cases of this that I certainly recall. I recall a case in Geelong in Victoria in Australia, mm-hmm. where a group of there were two major groups of pathologists in the town, and it was found that they were consulting about prices and coincidentally, as it turned out not coincidentally, the prices they were charging for their services were within a few cents of each other. So it's fairly transparent that when this is happening, and the penalties for it are significant. I don't see it very often. I think the level of ethics, the degree of ethics and integrity in the healthcare profession is extremely high. So I think it's an unnatural and an unlikely thing to happen in any case. And I have to say that in the cases that I've known where it's happened, it's where non-professionals own the business and employ the professionals in it. So I think for a start, the ethical levels and the integrity in the profession is high, and it's unlikely to happen. I think should it happen, it becomes very transparent, and the penalties are severe. There's no guarantee that you can prevent it, but I think there's strong disincentives to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Next, we have what happens when the regulators fail, which is the case in many developing countries, such as Ghana.
Yes, I'm not familiar with Ghana. I'm not familiar with regulation systems in developing countries. Mm-hmm. Regulators fail. I mean, there's no doubt in the case studies that I've shown today make it clear that regulators fail. I think it's a question of eternal vigilance. I think one of the strengths of the system that combines both self-regulation and imposed regulation is that you have two watchdogs. and often I've seen cases where something is missed by the self-regulator that's picked up by the imposed regular and vice versa. So I think the important thing is to have clear sanctions and to have robust and highly effective regulatory systems. Now, I acknowledge that they can't be created overnight. I acknowledge where those systems are not in place, regulation is more likely to fail. So I guess it's a matter of lessons learned from jurisdictions where it has worked. But being no expert on the way in which regulation operates in developing countries, my answer's probably not been very helpful to the questioner.
Well, I'm sure you hit on a few key elements, Peter. Next we have, even in 2013, it remains extremely difficult for a nurse to suggest a doctor may not be doing the right thing. Any comments on how to overcome this?
That's true. It is difficult. I think we've come a long way. I think the role of nurses has changed. Increasingly, when we are training professionals, we're training them as a member of a team rather than as an individual, and I've seen that change personally quite dramatically over the 20 years or so that I've been involved in this. And in the surgical training for which I was responsible for Australia and New Zealand, we were emphasising the surgeon as a member of a team, and we trained the surgeon as a member of a team. And I think the interprofessional respect that exists now is much greater than it was previously. I do acknowledge, however, that it is still difficult for the person that perhaps is not at the peak of that team to blow the whistle on what is going on. But I do believe also that the introduction of mandatory reporting, as has been done as a result of the Patel case, is a huge step forward. And I do believe that statutory protection is another step forward, because professionals at all levels are more inclined to report incidents that they see. And I referred in the Patel case to what I found really quite fascinating, that this enormous cultural shift has happened. So whereas there was in the past certainly fear and intimidation on the part of the more junior members, say, of a team, that is much less the case now, and the cultural expectation now that people report runs right through the team. So I think things are improving. I acknowledge they're not perfect, and I think given time and the advent of some of these new systems, it will continue to get better. Whether there is a level playing field completely, I can't say, but it's certainly much better now than it was, and I hope that continues.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. 2 more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The next one is, what would give incentive for cooperation between physicians for the benefit of the patient?
Could I have that again, Jane?
What would give incentive for cooperation between physicians for the benefit of the patient?
Cooperation between physicians.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm not sure if you mean physicians from different specialties, but let me just answer the question as I hear it.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that is happening increasingly is that the training of healthcare professionals is now involving an appreciation of the position of the patient. And I think that patient considerations are now being built into training programs, and I can give you 2 examples. Healthcare professionals, and perhaps surgeons in particular, are notoriously poor at communication. Communication with their colleagues, communication with their patients, probably communications with their family, I don't know. But in order to try and address this, in our training program at the College of Surgeons, we introduced some training videos around communication. One was based on communicating news to a patient of the diagnosis of breast cancer, and the way in which this ought to be done. And these training videos, and there were several of them produced ultimately, were dramatized stories. I mean, they were dramas. They were turned into stories. We employed real actors and had a real script written, and they were part of the training of surgeons in communication. I think they had a big impact, and I think now when you look at the training programs now, the patient is at the heart of all of them, at least in the ones with which I'm familiar. So I think the relationship between patient and professional is much improved. The other thing that we did was to teach surgeons as part of their training to understand what was true informed consent. And true informed consent is much more than handing someone a paper to sign. True informed consent is about dealing with the issues that confront each individual patient, and these issues will be different patient to patient. And there's a famous case in Australia called the Rogers and Whittaker case, which goes to this. And it's not sufficient to give general advice on informed consent, like you might get 10% of getting an infection, 0.011% of cutting off the wrong leg and that sort of thing. You actually have to talk to the patient about the patient's own particular concerns in relation to the procedure, because every person's life is different. And if it's an operation on the throat, that's more important to an opera singer than it is to somebody else, and so it goes. So I think the patient and the professional are closer together. I think team training brings the professional team, the members of the professional team, closer together. So again, I think things are improving, but I guess as long as the demand for healthcare services outstrips supply, and people have to be dealt with expeditiously, there's never going to be enough time for a doctor to spend with a patient. I think things are better, but I still think we have work to do.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Peter. On to the last question. How can it be illegal not to report things going wrong, yet at the same time there is statutory protection for individuals if there is disclosure in a peer review that cannot result in legal action against a health professional?
Great question. On the one hand, if I'm a nurse in the operating room and on 2 or 3 occasions I notice that a surgeon is uncertain or obviously approaching the operation in the wrong way, in the past I might have decided that the surgeon was too powerful and my job was at risk and I didn't say anything. Now if I do that under the mandatory reporting regulations, I can be disciplined for not reporting that. At the same time, if that surgeon then walks out of the operating room and goes to the peer review meeting and says, look, I'm really uncertain around this procedure, and his colleagues say, well, either we'll test how uncertain you are, your uncertainty is not going to be overcome by additional training, so we're going to recommend to the hospital that your operating rights be curtailed. That is, you will not be able to do that operation again. Or they might decide that there is with some training, the surgeon could actually do the procedure very, very well, so the surgeon is sent off for training. So that doesn't mean, and that surgeon is protected under the statutory protection arrangements. It doesn't mean that what the nurse in reporting that surgeon has done is wrong. It doesn't mean that that the surgeon is wrong to have gone and admitted that and to seek redress. I think the two can sit side by side. So it is a requirement under the law that that I report things that I'm concerned about. It is a protection under the law that someone that is not guilty of gross negligence or not guilty of a criminal offence can be protected, so that we can hope that overall quality will be improved. I think the two can sit side by side.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Peter. A lot of questions there. So what I'm going to do is bring the webinar to a close. Lastly, just to say, any questions that weren't answered, we will answer by email. And if you have any extra questions, please feel free to email them in to us. And lastly, in order to gain credit points for viewing the webinar and participating, you have to answer 3 questions in the education forum, and they will be available over the next 24 hours. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Bye now.